We are going to be recording. All right, so here we go. Welcome back to Photo School. Again, if you can make yourself do this, that would be great. I'd appreciate it. And today we're going to talk about camera basics and shooting in manual mode. I'm a very, very firm believer that your camera is not smarter than you. So let's turn off the automatic mode and learn the ins and outs of manual. It's kind of like that idea that shooting in manual mode is doing math without a calculator. It can be a little hard at first, but once you get going, you really know what you're doing. So just a couple introductions on the different types of cameras that a lot of us are working with. There's DSLRs, which is a digital single lens reflex camera. Those are your really basic cameras you see now where you can remove the lens and put the lens back on. This diagram over here is kind of like how a DSLR, I hate saying that all the way out, but how a DSLR shows how light and images are made. So as you see, the light enters through the lens and passes through the aperture ring, and it bounces off the mirror and up through this prism through the viewfinder. So you see exactly what it is that you're photographing, except for that fraction of a second when you're taking the photo, your mirror flips up and the light goes straight through, passes through the shutter and onto your sensor plate, or if you're in the film world, onto your film. A mirrorless camera is very similar, except there's no mirror in it, which makes mirrorless cameras very compact and very light. Mirrorless cameras have come a really long way. A lot of photographers, professional photographers, are giving up their DSLRs for mirrorless solely because they weigh less, they take up less space, and carrying around a DSLR all the time can do a number to your neck and your back. Point and shoot cameras, these are your like pocket-sized cameras. They were really big in the early 2000s. Your grandparents might still have one. Your parents might still have one. They're still around and they're still available. There's some really amazing high-quality ones, so don't let those fool you. And then lastly, your phone camera. You guys know this. I don't think I need to explain what a phone camera is. But we're going today learn about how to shoot in manual by controlling your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, and then learn these different exposure techniques to get the certain types of looks and effects that you want. Here's another diagram I pulled that kind of shows the difference between a DSLR and a mirrorless. There's way less stuff for your image to transfer through. And with a mirrorless camera, you have an optical viewfinder, or excuse me, an electric viewfinder instead of an optical where things are bounced through mirrors and into your eyeball. All right, so buttons, knobs, and rings. There's a lot, and I'm gonna flip out of this in a second so we can kind of figure out on your cameras exactly what we're looking at. So there is an on and off switch. I'm sure at this point you all have figured out where that is. A lot of your cameras have a button on the outside of the body to set your ISO. Some of you might have a knob that you can dial that will show you where your ISO is. Additionally, sometimes certain cameras have like a button that you press and then you move a knob to adjust it. Your shutter speed dial, this is typically on a DSLR or mirrorless, is one of these knobs right here where your forefinger or your thumb lands on the right hand side. This is going to just adjust how fast your shutter opens and closes, which determines how much light is recorded for your image. Then you're going to have your aperture ring or dial. Sometimes your lens will have an aperture ring, and that is going to adjust how much light enters through the lens. And if you don't have an aperture ring, you most likely have a knob on your camera that you can adjust that will change up your aperture. White balance, I talked a little bit about in the last two classes where your white balance lies. Or how to adjust your white balance. So we'll talk about that. Again, most of these cameras have a little button you hit down, you can adjust your white balance. We're going to look at the different shooting modes that are available. Those would be manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, automatic, and program. The only one you need to know about today is manual, and ever again for the rest of your life. That's all we're going to talk about today. Then we're going to talk about your lenses a little bit. So those have a zoom ring, if your lens will zoom in and out, a focus ring in case you want to manually focus, but also there's a little knob on your lenses that you have to turn on if you want them to use automatic focus, which would be your manual and automatic or manual switch. So I'm going to exit out of this screen share real quick so we can pop in. Everybody have a camera? Cool. All right, so everybody know where your on and off button is. You guys can actually talk. You can take yourselves off mute because this is going to be easier than really bad sign language. Cool. So does everybody know how to turn your camera on?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Perfect. Look, we are in great shape already. All right. Does everybody know how to change your ISO on your camera?
Yep.
You're good. You're not sure. What kind of camera do you have, Jillian?
It's an old one. It's got like it looks like that.
Okay, so you probably have go ahead and take it down. You probably can change it. If you don't have an actual button on here that says ISO, you can go into your menu.
Oh, I do. Okay.
You do? Cool. So usually if you hit that, is that a Canon or a Nikon?
It's a Canon.
Well, I think on the Canons, you hold down that ISO button and you move. Do you have a wheel on the back of it?
Yeah.
So you can hit that wheel and adjust and change. Is it moving? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Ellie, how about you? Do you know where yours is?
I don't have a camera.
You don't have a camera. It's okay.
No.
So, but you'll know after today that changing your ISO will kind of get you what you want. How about your aperture ring or your aperture knob? We're good with those?
Yeah.
Cool.
I don't really know this camera. It's the one that my dad gave me.
Oh, so that's super old, right?
It's like one of the first like digital cameras, but it's still film.
Oh, it's still film?
Yeah.
That's awesome. So if there's not an aperture ring, that those cameras that kind of moved between like film and digital and were like those in between generation like this one, you probably have an aperture ring just like the cameras in class used to have on your lens.
Maybe.
And if not, typically on those cameras, the Canons, you can adjust your wheel. Sometimes you can set it to where you can use that wheel to change your aperture, or there's a button with like a little star that you can press and you hold that down and then adjust your wheel. And that should change it on a Canon.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I have this one. It says like AEB. And then I have AF.
Okay, that's automatic exposure and then automatic focus.
Okay.
Let's look at that later. If you want to stay on, we can kind of look over those buttons.
Okay.
And then for your shutter speed, guys, you should just have like a single knob that you can adjust to do that. And on the your white balance, Jillian, because yours is film, you're probably not going to have a white balance setting, because you would have to use a basic like 18% gray card. And then, Will, I'm guessing you know where your white balance is on your camera. Awesome.
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Ellie, if you want to follow along with some stuff, if you have an iPhone, there's 2 apps that you can download. One is Moment, which I believe is free. Don't hold me to that. Moment or Manual that will act as a manual camera on your phone. And so you can see a lot of these same settings that we're talking about today. All right, guys, so I'm gonna screen share and we're gonna talk a little bit about our lenses, because lenses have a lot of numbers on them as well that can get really confusing if you don't know what they are. And at the end of the day, they do kind of play into how we can adjust our exposures. So lenses have a lot of numbers. and a lot that goes on with them. So lenses have different focal lengths, and that just means how close it is that that your lens is perceiving what it is that you're shooting. So the lower the millimeter value, the wider your lens is. So if your lens on it, if you look, typically on your lenses, you have like a little plate that says the size of your lens or the focal length. So you'll have 15 millimeters, which is a pretty, fisheye type lens. Anything from about 24 to 35 is going to be a wide angle lens. That means you're going to see a whole lot of your frame. 50 millimeters is a pretty standard normal lens. And by normal, I mean like what we're used to seeing with our human eye. And then anything that is 85 millimeters or higher typically falls in that telephoto range. So what people often mistake for being a zoom lens. Lenses have speeds. They have different speeds, and this is based on your aperture, or what is also known as your f-stop. So the lower the number is that is on your lens, like if you look on this lens thing, you'll see, 1:4. That is the lowest or the fastest your lens can get. So what that means is the opening in your lens adjusts. And what I mean by speed, typically you can take photos at a higher shutter speed if your lens allows more light in. So the lowest you're going to get on the standard lenses, unless you shell out about $10,000 for a lens, is going to be 1.4. So that means you're going to have a really wide opening in your lens. A lot of light is going to be able to get in. There are two types of lenses. There are prime lenses, which means they are fixed. You cannot zoom these in between focal lengths. If you want to zoom, you got to use your feet. And then there's zoom lenses, which means you can adjust the focal length by twisting on your zoom ring. Typically, if you look on the screen, zoom lenses have two different numbers. They say 18 to 55. So the widest it can go is 18 millimeters, and the closest in focal length, I guess you can go, would be 55. And sometimes you see the aperture written as 1:3.5 to 5.6. So that means the aperture is variable with how zoomed in your lens is. Sometimes though, you can get a lens that has a fixed aperture, like 2.8. And when you have a fixed aperture, it's a pretty fast zoom lens, also means pretty expensive zoom lens. So I'm gonna pop out of this screen sharing real quick. Did you guys see me holding any of these things up while I was doing that?
Yeah.
Okay, you did. So you guys must have the thing turned off. So this is a prime lens. This is what we call our nifty 50. This is a lens hood, so you could attach this on if you're out and you don't want any lens flare, or maybe it's a little drizzly outside. This is really good for helping to keep your lens nice and protected. It's kind of a joke. Here's your lens cap. You guys know all these things. If you're looking on these numbers, is this normal for you all, or is it backwards?
It's normal.
Oh, cool. Okay. So this one is a 50 millimeter lens. There's no dash with it, so we know that it is a prime lens. If I want to zoom, I zoom with my feet. And then we see 1:1.4. This means it is a really, really fast lens. It can let in a whole lot of light. If you look, you can see the aperture in there. That is a very, very tiny, tiny aperture, because that's how this lens, when it's off the body, it shuts itself down like that. Other things on this lens, you can see the automatic to manual focus switch. If this is not turned on, your camera cannot focus your lens. Always make sure that that's turned on, especially if you're flipping in and out of lenses. Sometimes things in camera bags can flip that. And then if I'm looking on the back side of this, these right here are your contacts. These are what make your lens talk to your camera. If you're having issues, it is okay to take this off of your camera wipe over these with like a lens cloth, and then wipe over the contacts on your camera. I'll show you what those contacts look like here. Here on this camera, they're the contacts. So you can always wipe those down if you need to a little bit. And then when you're attaching your lens to your camera, take your red dot here and your red dot on your lens, meet them up, and then twist until you hear it lock. And then you'll be good to go on this. So that's a prime lens. Now we're going to talk about a zoom lens. So here's a zoom lens. This is a 24 to 70 millimeters. So it goes from pretty wide, and then the focal distance that it sees, it kind of comes in a little bit tighter. Here is your zoom ring, so you can zoom in and out. And you can see too here, this lens needs to go to Nikon and get some repairs done on its grips. But you can see where, maybe, can you guys see that? All right, so we have 24 here to 70. So as you're adjusting this, where that white dot is where your focal length is. So this is 35, this is 50, and then of course there's all the numbers in between that you can use as well. Here's your focal ring on this. A lot of cameras will still allow you to manual focus even if you have autofocus turned on. Autofocus on cameras these days is absolutely phenomenal. You, unless you're filming video, because sometimes the motor in here, can you guys hear that? If you're shooting video, your camera will pick that sound up and it can be really distracting. Unless you know you're going to throw, music over it or something. But if you are, you really don't need to use manual focus unless you absolutely want to. And that is the only automatic thing I'm going to allow you all to use on your camera is autofocus. So this is kind of like a standard, really good in-between lens. And then if you want, this is great for like shooting sports. You can also shoot portraits with this. This is a 70 to 200. So it kind of goes from like a really, really wide-ish telephoto to something that is really super tight in. And it is a beast. It is heavy. There are larger lenses than this, but this is also a really good option. You can see here's the plate that kind of gives you all the stats. And this has a fixed aperture of 2.8 on it. So those are some lenses. Those are what those numbers mean. If you're ever like, I don't know what these numbers mean, and you're like trying to buy a lens, that's what you need to know. But if you have questions, you guys can always send me a message and ask. All right. So last thing before we really dive into manual mode are memory cards. I've had a lot of people ask what memory cards are what, and what do all these numbers mean? So there's really three major types of memory cards these days. You have your XQD card, which is designed to be your next like compact flash card. So if you're looking over at the photos, the first one on top is a compact flash. And then you have your XQD cards, and then you have your memory, your SD cards, which are the most common. You guys see these everywhere. I think you can even buy them in gas stations these days. CF and XQDs, typically they were like what was made for the more professional cameras that have really, really like huge files, and then you need to be able to write and record those files really quickly. But now actually SD cards are also just as fast. They're just not as reliable because your contacts are exposed on them. And then you have mini SD cards, which usually typically come with an adapter, so you can put them in like a normal SD card size. But you'll see these in like GoPros, and you'll see them in phones sometimes. But that's basically what, oops, I'm gonna bring this back up, guys. Basically what these mean. So if you're looking on these diagrams, you always have a read speed, and that's how fast you can read and access those files. And then you have a writing speed, especially if you are shooting video or 1080 or 4K video, or even some cameras are now doing 6K and 8K. You're going to need a fast memory card, and that's where the cost comes in on memory cards, is on speed and size, not just size anymore. So I'm going to exit out of screen share. So I don't have any CF cards available really quick, but here's an XQD card. This is what these look like these days. Sony's and Nikon's have started taking XQDs. I don't think Canon takes those. Here is an SD card. They're about the same-ish size, but here's the difference. Your contacts on your XQD live internally, and these live on the outside. So you really don't want to get these scratched, or you will mess up, you know, $128 piece of plastic with some like technology inside. That would suck. And then you have your mini SD cards. So this is in its adapter. It's hard to do this backwards. So here's these itty bitty little ones. These are really great for GoPros. This little thing sticks right inside of it. But what's really nice about the adapters is you can still use them in a camera or an audio recorder or whatever you need them for. Useful, but not as reliable as people think. Pretty reliable, will not make it through the washing machine. Check your pockets. These XQD cards and CF cards will make it through the washing machine, although I will not guarantee that your images will live, but they won't be destroyed. All right, so do you guys have any questions on lenses, camera body buttons, or memory cards before we dive in?
Can you use different lenses on different cameras? Like you have Nikon lenses, can you use it on your Fujifilm or?
So different lenses on different cameras you can use if you have a converter ring. I don't actually have any converter rings. I've been looking at purchasing one, so I can use my Nikon lenses on this Fuji. But it's basically like a ring that attaches onto the back here, and then you can mount it on. So it changes when you're purchasing a lens, like on Nikon, it's called an F mount. You can buy an F mount to Fuji converter, and it attaches on, and then you can just use it just fine. Sometimes it takes away a little bit of the quality, but they're all fairly like pretty good now. So that is a thing. Like if you guys are using multiple cameras, a converter is not that expensive in the realm of like what gear costs. And it's definitely cheaper than buying a brand new lens. So I think at the mostly I see them are between like 120 to 250, depending on like the type of camera and the quality of a converter you're buying, but definitely cheaper than paying $2,000 for a new lens. So, all right. Any other questions on gear stuff? No? Cool. We're going to jump back in and pop into exposure. So exposure, this is what you guys thought you were coming here for, and now we're finally here. So exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor or film, if you're still shooting film, and it is going to determine how bright or dark your photo is. Exposure is a give and take. It is like being in a relationship. You have to make compromises to get anywhere with your exposure. I really love the exposure triangle because it kind of shows you how exposure works with your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed. And like I said, it is a very fine balancing act. One more thing before we get started, I'm going to be using the word stops a lot, like a full stop, which is a full step or a measurement in between exposures. For instance, if you're looking on your camera and you see like 60 to 125 or 125 to, 250, that is going to be a stop. Give me 1 second, guys. I am trying to, Zoom is trying to send me a notification and I can't get out of it. All right, we're just gonna keep on going. Here's basically some ideas of what your light meters look like. So this first on the top left-hand corner is a standard light meter. You will see this on the back of your cameras. You will also see this in your viewfinder. Your goal with exposure is to always get this level indicator lined up as close as you can to the center for whatever it is you're photographing. If you're too far on the plus side, you're overexposed. If you're too far on the negative side, you are underexposed. And those can be really hard to salvage when you're in Photoshop or in the dark room. If things are too dark, there's no data or grain there to salvage. And if they're too bright, same thing. There's no data or grain on your film to salvage when you're doing anything in post. Some of you guys will not see a light meter on your camera, and that is okay. This is the back of a Nikon screen that will show you kind of like where your, light meter exists on the back of that. And you can see you have your shutter speed and your aperture, which we're gonna get into. And then the most important thing that is gonna help you figure out where to put your, well, how to meter per se, is the different metering modes on cameras. So cameras, here's just what the symbols look like on Canon versus Nikon. If you're shooting on a Fuji, they look pretty much the same as Nikon. But so you have evaluative and matrix, which are the same thing. It's just Canon and Nikon choose to use different names because they're petty like that. But basically what it does is it looks at the center of your frame to kind of figure out what it is you're metering. And then also takes into account what is going on light-wise in the rest of your frame to help you choose how to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture and your ISO to get your light meter lined up. Center weighted is exactly that. It kind of takes like this blob of the center of your viewfinder, of your frame, and meters off of that. Sometimes that can be accurate. Sometimes it cannot be that accurate. I think evaluative is a little bit of a stronger metering mode to use these days. Your phone works in evaluative or matrix mode when it is taking a basic exposure. And then spot is a very, very small, tiny spot where your camera chooses to meter from, and it is in the center of your frame. So if you want to measure for your highlights, you need to point the center of your frame at wherever the highlight is and adjust your exposure before you then compose your frame and take your photo. So that's kind of where we're at with that. The closest thing to spot on your phone is when you tap in your highlights or you tap in your shadows and make your own adjustments is what you're gonna have with spot. What I really love about spot is you can get some really cool dramatic lighting versus something that is just a bit more, I don't know, not as dramatic, I guess, as evaluative or matrix, but all important. You can change them anytime you want. But if you're just like learning the ropes and happy to be shooting in manual mode, I would keep it on evaluative or matrix. Do you guys have any questions on light meters before I move on? All right. Let's see. We are gonna keep on going. So ISO. ISO is the first thing I like to set when I'm working on exposure. It is not part of your luminous exposure because it actually deals with how sensitive your sensor or your film is to light. and it's not actually adjusting how your camera sees light. Your ISO values always double, although on digital cameras now you can have half stops and third stops. So typically your ISO is going to start around 100, and you can go all the way up on digital cameras now to like 256,000, which is huge. Most of the time you're not going to want to go any higher than 12,800, because the difference is when you have a higher ISO, you're sacrificing quality. So you are going to get a grainier and a noisier image. Again, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that, especially if that's the look and the artistic look that you want in your photos. But you always want to try to shoot at the lowest possible ISO for your image quality. So ISO is pretty easy. The lower your ISO is, the less sensitive it is to light. So if you're shooting outside in the middle of the day, take it as low as you can. You can probably get it at 100. The higher your ISO is, the more sensitive it is to light. You're going to see a lot more grain and a lot more noise. You can kind of tell that in the example image that I'm giving you. However, sometimes you have to shoot with a really high ISO because you need to freeze motion when you're shooting sports, and so you need a really fast shutter speed. Or you want to make sure that everything in your frame is in focus, so you need a really, really deep, aperture. So you can adjust ISO. You don't always have to shoot at the lowest. Here's some examples, light-wise, how ISO works. So you can see at ISO 100, this frame is getting not a lot of light entering in. Then you see 320, 800, 1250, 2000, and 6400. And you can see as this progresses, the quality of the image is getting less and less, a little grainy, a little blotchy. So you kind of always want to shoot as low as possible as you can. Here's an image that was shot at like I don't know, 6400 ISO. It was really high. So you can see a lot of this grain popping in. And then here's another image where I was just working at this restaurant, and earlier in the day, if you look on the left, you can tell I have a lower ISO versus the right-hand side. You can see a bit more grain, a bit more lack of quality, I guess, in the way that the colors are rendered and the way that the light is rendered throughout this. Guys, I am getting a notification that this thing is going to die out. So I am going to stop this, and then you guys can call right back in, okay? Let me get you guys going. We've got our recording up and we've got our screen share going. So we were talking a little bit about, oh, I'm trying to hide this. We were talking about ISO and kind of the quality aspects of ISO. Again, really high quality ISO, not necessarily the best camera or the best photo. And then in these two images, you can tell like in the colors and the quality of the light, the difference in the fact that the one on the left was shot with a lower ISO and the one on the right is shot at a higher ISO. We're going to dig into that a little bit more as we continue through shutter speed and aperture, and you'll see a little bit more about how all three of these work together. So aperture. This is one of my favorite lighting tools to play with because it really can help determine, one, how your photo looks artistically, in addition to how you can set your exposures. So aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. So this determines how much light can enter into the camera. So if you look over on the chart, you can see when you're aperture is set to the lowest f-stop, which is what we call our aperture values, f1.4, it is wide open, which means a lot of light can come through that lens. But as you stop your aperture down, that opening closes and gets tighter and tighter and tighter, all the way to f22, which is an itty bitty, little itty bitty hole, which means not a lot of light can pass through that. Now, what I love about aperture is that it affects your depth of field, which is how much of your frame, how much of your photo is in focus. So if you're focusing on somebody's eyes, for instance, when you're shooting wide open at 1.4, the tip of their nose or their ears might be out of focus because you have a very, very shallow focal plane or depth of field. Whereas if you're shooting at f16, f22, you know, these higher numbers, more of your frame is going to be in focus. You're going to have a much deeper focal plane, a deeper depth of field. Aperture will allow you to get stuff like bokeh, which is, you know, the pretty light that you can like, looks like out of focus fuzzy dots in photos. It can also allow, you know, if you're taking a landscape photo, for you to see everything in focus as you're going through. I wanted to talk a little bit about the numbers. Again, the stops for aperture, if you're looking at the numbers that I have written out here, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, if you kind of look at these, it skips over one and it doubles. So if you're ever trying to figure out your apertures in your head, that's how it works. So f1.4 to 1.4 times 2 is 2.8. And then f2 jumps to f4, 2.8 to 5.6. Just kind of like a little tidbit in your head if you're trying to remember those. However, there are values that exist in between f1.4 and f2. You'll have typically 1.8. In between 2 and 2.4, you have 2 and 2.8, you'll have 2.4. So you'll have varying stops, half stops and third stops, just like you do with your ISO as well. So here's some examples. We're going to kind of look at these. If you look at the photo of the corn on the right-hand side, you're going to see that it is shot at a shallow depth of field because not a lot of this photo is in focus. In fact, just the front ears of corn closest to us are in focus and everything else is out of focus. Versus the photo on the right-hand side, which has a much deeper depth of field. So it is shot with a larger f-stop because more of this stuff is in focus. So you're able to tell that based on the photos. Same thing here. If you look at the photo of the pickles, or of the pickle, excuse me, that's a very shallow depth of field. Everything in the background is out of focus. Versus this photo on the right, which kind of has an in-between depth of field because you can kind of see these other things, but then things that are still kind of close to him are out of focus, like the 79 cents a pound sign is just out of focus, and these fruits and vegetables that are behind him are just out of focus. Another thing that affects your depth of field, in addition to what you set your aperture to, is the type of lens you're shooting with, but also how physically close you are to what it is you're photographing. If you're closer to something with a lens, you're typically going to have excuse me, that's going to be confusing if I say it that way. You're typically going to have a shallower depth of field if you're closer to something. Whether you're close because you're physically close to it or you have a really telephoto lens that puts you close to it. Does that make sense, guys? It's okay if I blew your mind, don't worry about it. Same thing in here. Here's an example, 2 examples of opposites. In the photo of the woman over here with the skewer, you can see that it's a very shallow depth of field. Her hands are in focus, but her face is out of focus. Whereas if you look at this landscape photo, a lot of things in here are in focus. So it has a very deep depth of field. And then you can kind of play around with bokeh a little bit. Bokeh is just like this out of focus light. People really love it. It's kind of become a thing. People add fake bokeh into their photos all the time. I don't recommend it because you can tell that it is fake, but just shooting at a shallow depth of field is going to give you that look. And if you don't have lights to play around with, you can also, my husband is going to hate that this photo of him is in here, but you can kind of also get it with foliage, because you can see how light pops through the leaves of the tree. So you get these little orbs of light and even colored light, depending on the time of year that you're taking pictures. So that is aperture in a nutshell. Think about this. So aperture can be a little difficult, and I'm gonna go over this one more time. The lower your f-stop, the more light enters, and the shallower your depth of field is. Think about jumping in a pool at 1.4 feet. That's pretty shallow. And then the higher your f-stop is, the less light enters, and the deeper your depth of field is. 22-foot pool is really deep. Okay, so keep those in the back of your head. All right, shutter speed. There's a lot to unpack here, but shutter speed is basically how fast your shutter opens and shuts to let light pass through the aperture and into the camera to record on your film or your sensor. That's that like ch-chink that you hear all the time. If you listen, that's your shutter moving. If you're shooting on a film camera, it's going to be much louder, more mechanical sounding. So that's how shutter speed works. Your speeds, your true full stops, start with B. B stands for bulb, and that means you control with your shutter button on your camera when it closes and when it opens. Which is really cool if you're trying to take pictures like really late at night, or you're really trying to blur motion. Your other shutter speeds, and these are parts of seconds. So you have 1, which is 1 full second. 2 is half a second. Then you have a 4th, an 8th, 15th, 30th, 60th. Keep 60 in mind. We're going to talk a lot about that in a second. 1/25th, 2/50th, and you'll see these kind of double. There's a few spots in here where they don't quite double. That's because we can't do math. Photographers can't do math all that well. But so you have 1/25th, 2/50th, 500th, 1000th, 2000th, 4000th, and now you can go all the way to an 8,000th of a second, which is faster than we blink. And that's pretty fast. You can stop motion, especially if you're shooting sports, really well with that. And by the way, photographers can do math, but we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the nanoseconds as to how those double. So shutter speed is very intuitive. The slower the shutter speed, the more light can enter in because it's open longer, right? But the faster the shutter speed is, the less light will enter. So if it's, a slow shutter speed where it opens and then closes, you get more light, versus a fast shutter speed and you will get less light. You always want to be aware of what your shutter speed is though, because if it is too slow, you will get camera shake or blur, and you will not stop or freeze your motion. So the number I wanted you to think of, 60th of a second is your sweet spot. Most people can stay still for a 60th of a second so their camera doesn't create any shake. And Jillian, you remember me saying this a lot, but camera shake is not allowed. And I have an example of camera shake. That's what camera shake looks like. It's gross. It's ugly. It is not allowed. Find yourself a tripod or a sturdy wall or something to lean and prop yourself up against so you can stay as still as possible. Hold your breath and know you can do it. So if you're shooting under a 60th of a second, you are running the risk of having camera shake. So always try to find ways to stabilize yourself and your camera as much as possible. But you can have intentional movement in your photos, whereas the photo of this dancer, that movement is frozen. It is completely frozen. You're not seeing any blur happening here. This is an example of motion blur. So motion blur is when your camera stays still and motion moves in and out of your frame, and you can see that motion. So in this photo, you see this guy walking by taking a selfie, kind of blurred out, but everything else in the photo is sharp. That's the difference. Not sharp, sharp. This is panning. This is a photo by a good friend from college named Andrew Dye, who is an amazing award-winning photographer out of Winston-Salem. I cannot take a photo of panning that is this good. So panning is the type of motion you get when you move with the motion while you are pressing your shutter button down. So it is hard to do, but it essentially blurs everything out and it keeps your subject sharp and in focus. This is really good if you're trying to clean up backgrounds or trying to show how fast something is moving in your photos. It's hard to do, but when it's done well and executed well, the results are great. So one more, actually. Here's an example of shooting on bulb or B. You can create really cool star trails. Now, don't get me wrong. This is many, many photos photographed on bulb mode where I, the photographer, am controlling how long my shutter is open for, and then I shut it. And then this photo specifically is a composite of like 100 different photos in Photoshop. So you can see the trails of the stars going. But you can take really cool photos using bulb. I suggest you use a remote for your camera. A lot of cameras come with a remote, or even now like this Fujifilm, my phone can talk to it and I can use my phone as a remote to take photos without having to even touch my camera. So that is useful if you're trying to take photos like this, so you're not getting any camera shake, because camera shake is not allowed. And then one thing I want to talk about before we really get going into, how do I stop share? Stop share. Hello, is using your hands to take photos. So hand metering is especially important because it allows you to get your shutter speed lined up and get your aperture lined up. And it allows you to put your hand in the middle of your frame based off of the type of light you're shooting in. So if you're outside in really bright light, make sure that the palm of your hand has that same kind of light you want to photograph in. If you're looking at the palm of my hand right now, you can see how the light is changing based on how it's hitting my hand, right? So same thing if you're outside. Like if I was taking a picture of you right now, Jillian, the light in your space is different than an Ellie space. So I would put my hand, not that I can do that, but I would put my hand next to your face and just like meter off of it really quickly. and make sure in my camera that by adjusting my shutter speed and my aperture that I'm getting my light meter lined up, and then I will take that photo. The beautiful thing about shooting on digital now is that you can see this photo, like if I'm trying to adjust, whoa, if I'm trying to adjust here, you can now look at the back of your camera and see how that photo is turning out. Now, I promise this photo is exposed well, but it's just how the camera is reading it. So your hand is a very important tool. Your hand is great. Some people say you should only use the palm of your hand. I am going to argue that you should actually use the back of your hand, especially if you're going to be taking photos of people who have different skin tones than you. Just ask them to put their hand out or up next to their face and get in close to their hand so it is in the center in that metering space. It's in the center of your frame so you can adjust your light meter to get it lined up. That's what the hand mode is. It's great. So let me screen share back and kind of go over hand metering with you guys. So again, you're setting your exposure based on highlights or shadows. So if you're out and you really want to focus on the highlights, make sure your hand is in those bright lights. The thing with manual mode is that every different type of light you are in, your settings are going to change. So when I was very young and learning how to shoot in manual mode, every time I moved rooms or went from inside to outside or outside in shadow to outside in direct sunlight, I have this photo of my hand hanging out in front of me in different types of light so I can get my exposure correct. You can always look on the back of your camera. You can make adjustments. It's a beautiful thing. Back in the film days, you could not make adjustments, but now you can. So I would advise utilizing that. Utilize this technique. It'll be your best friend. Even now, if I'm out taking photos and I'm not in a studio setting, but out doing more like documentary work or portraits of people, I will put my hand out, meter off of it real quick, and then move on. That way I know that my exposure is correct. Any questions on this hand metering technique?
No.
No? Cool. Now, exposure bracketing. We talked a little bit about this on Friday with lights, but I'm just going to touch on this real quick. It again is taking a series of photos, usually 3 or 5 of the same subject and the same setup at different exposures. Because sometimes when you get your perfect exposure, it's not really what you want. So take 1 to 2 underexposed, 1 perfectly exposed, and 1 to 2 overexposed. And you can kind of see, you know, what your personal preference is, how you want that look, and what it is that you want for that specific photo. Again, shooting with your light meter in the middle is not always correct for that situation that you're shooting in, but it's a great place to start. So just to recap before we go on, and then I'm going to kind of go over a couple examples of shutter speed and aperture and ISO with you guys. So 2 types of lenses. You have your prime lens and you have your zoom lens. So prime stays at the same focal length, and if you want to zoom in, you need to walk and get physically closer. A zoom lens has a variable focal length. Exposure is a give and take. Exposure is a give and take. So think about it this way. If you're shooting outside and you have a high ISO, I'm going to zoom all the way back real quick, guys, to this triangle. So if you have a high ISO, so let's look at the top of this triangle at 25,600, you're letting a lot of light into your camera. So you're gonna have to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture to make up for all that light you're letting in. And vice versa. If you're shooting with less light, say at ISO 100, you're gonna need a slower shutter speed, or you're gonna need a shallower depth of field or a wider aperture. Does that make sense? Is that making sense to you guys, or is your mind just blown?
I'm good.
You're good? All right. Just some notes if you guys are taking notes. ISO, so back in the day with film, your film had a certain ISO and you set it and you forgot it and you just let it stay that the entire thing. ISO on digital now is variable. So just some notes. If you're outside shooting and it's really bright and sunny, you can shoot at ISO 100 or 200, and you could probably also shoot at ISO 400. If you're outside today where it's like kind of sunny, kind of cloudy, I would stick around ISO 400. Once it starts to get a little bit dark, or if you're inside and it's kind of dark where you are inside, you probably want anywhere between 400, 800, maybe even like 1,000 ISO. And then when it starts to get really dark and like it's dark outside and your lights are, turning on the lamps in your house, you're going to need something much higher, like 1,600, 3,200, 6,400. So those are just some notes on like if you're not sure what you should set your ISO to. But again, set it, adjust your aperture and your shutter speed, and then take your photo. And look on the back of your camera and see what you're getting. And if you don't like what you're getting, you can adjust and go from there. Let's see. So the three variables, again, we just talked about this: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO is going to influence the graininess or the noise you're going to have in your images. Think about it again. I'm going to repeat myself. 100 to 400 for outside and sunny, 400 to 800 for cloudy outside to inside. I'm going to tell you a secret. I basically always keep my ISO at 400. Always. Unless it's really dark and then I adjust it. Or I'm shooting for a client and they need it as low as possible to have the highest quality image. But if I'm just taking pictures for myself, for the most part, I'm shooting during the day and I have enough light that I can keep it set around 400 all the time. Aperture influences your depth of field. So if you're not sure where you want to set your aperture, I always want you to think of how much depth of field do you want? Do you want a really shallow depth of field because you want a lot of that really beautiful blur? Then set it as low as you can go. But if you want to see a whole lot of things, if you're out in the mountains and you're taking beautiful landscape shots and you want to see everything in focus, pump it up. But keep in mind, the higher your aperture goes, you're going to need a slower shutter speed because you're closing down that hole in your lens. And so your shutter needs to be open longer to let more light come in. And then lastly, shutter speed influences movement. So if you want to freeze movement, you need to have your shutter speed set at least to a 60th of a second. But even at a 60th of a second, if you're taking pictures of people walking, they're probably going to be a little, have a little bit of movement to them and not be tack sharp. If you're shooting sports, like soccer or football, you want your shutter speed as fast as you can get it, unless you're purposefully trying to blur movement. And always meter off your hand. It's there. If you want to go for the quote 18% gray, which is what the camera sees in general, I'm not really well versed in the science behind that, go for the palm of your hand. But if you're wanting to make sure people's skin tones are coming out properly and exposed properly, shoot on the back of your hand or the back of your subject's hand if they have a different skin tone than you do. Cameras are not made, and film was not made to work on any human that has skin darker than us. And that is not necessarily right, but there are lots of ways that we can get around that by using our exposure values, our shutter speed, and our aperture. So again, I'm going to say this one more time because I believe when it comes to shooting in manual mode, practice makes perfect. And understanding this formula really helps. One, set your ISO to the lowest possible it can be for every lighting situation. 400 is a great place to start. 2, determine the depth of field you desire and then set your aperture accordingly. And then 3, adjust your shutter speed to get your light meter lined up based off of your ISO that you already set and your aperture that you already set. All right, so a couple exercises for shooting in manual mode. So I want you, rules-wise, only shoot in manual mode. You're not going to get better at it if you're not shooting in manual. Always aim to have really well-exposed photographs. If you listened in on lighting and composition, try to apply your lighting techniques and your composition techniques. Always meter off your hand and practice social distancing. I do not want to be liable for you or others getting sick. And then tag me on Instagram or send me photos. You guys know how to get up with me. I'm here as a resource for you guys. So here's your exercise. Take 2 photos of the same subject, one at a shallow depth of field and one at a deep depth of field. Remember to adjust your settings accordingly to make up for how that changes the light. I want you to take a portrait with bokeh in the background. So do you, to get bokeh, remember you need to shoot at a very shallow depth of field. Take a high ISO, low light photo to show grain and noise. So think about taking this photo at night when it's starting to get dark in your house, or if you like to go for walks at night. So maybe think about taking a photo under a street lamp. Anything like that will really help bring out that grain and noise so you can kind of see what I'm talking about on your own photos. Take a long exposure showing blur, but make sure you stabilize your camera. So remember, blur is when movement is coming into the frame and the camera is still. Then you can take a long exposure showing panning. And so that's where the camera and you are moving with the motion. And I'll get off screen share in a second and kind of show you how to do that. For those 2, to actually start to see that motion show up, you want to set your your shutter speed to a 30th or slower. Okay. Then I want you to freeze movement with a high shutter speed. But remember, if you have a high shutter speed, you're going to have not a lot of light touching your sensor. So you need to adjust your aperture to let in more light, or adjust your ISO so it is more sensitive to light. So a higher ISO and a lower aperture will help you with that. And then I want you to bracket a series of photographs. I don't care what you bracket. And I want you to pick one variable to change on this. So keep 2 out of your 3 things the same and then adjust one thing. Personally, when I do this, I really just like to keep my shutter speed set and my ISO set and just change my aperture. But if you want to change that up, feel free to change that up. And then again, here's some minions and some Jerry doing Matt talk. You can do it. And I'm going to pop out a screen share real quick. So manual mode is intense, but you all can do it. Jillian, I know you can do manual mode. But real quick on panning. So say you're taking pictures of something moving like this. You're going to have your camera up and you are going to move across your frame, focus on your subject, hold your focus, and a lot of cameras you can lock your focus. On the back of your cameras, let's see, you'll see something called AFL. And if you hold that button down after you focus, it'll keep that focus. But if something's running across your frame, you're going to follow it like so. And that's it. And as you're following it, so say I'm starting here, I'm going to take my picture as I'm moving across. You can do this on phones and still get the same effect. It's best that you try not to do this in the middle of the day because there's so much light. You're not going to be able to slow down your shutter speed enough to get the look that you want. But in the mornings or like right now where it's kind of like overcast, you could probably do that. If you're looking for things to do to get that motion or movement happening, send a friend or family member outside to run across the driveway in front of you and take pictures of them, or have them hop on a bike, or go to a street where maybe cars are driving by and just practice following them, and then practice keeping your camera still and letting them create the blur in front of you. I'm trying to think of other ways you can do this. It's kind of hard to do those two if you're inside and there's not a lot of space to move around. But yeah, do you guys have any questions on manual mode or lenses or camera bodies or buttons?
I found the manual to my camera, so that
Oh, hey.
yeah.
That's cool. Also, if you sometimes if you ever lose it, usually if you just Google the make of the camera, all of the manuals now basically live as PDFs on a computer. So you can find those. And then those are easy too, because you can just like Control or Command F and like search the document for what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Which makes things a lot easier. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, again, send them my way. I'm here to help. And if you want manual stuff on your phone, Ellie, again, there's an app called Manual. I think that one is $3. And then the app called Moment. I'm going to look Moment up because when I got it, it was free, but it might again be like $2 or $3 now. But you can adjust all of these things in these apps on your phone, which is really cool because then you can kind of start practicing manual mode. And when you do get your camera, then you can do all of it the way, like you already have an idea of how to do it. Let me look real quick. Moment. So, yes, that's the one I want. So this one is called Pro Camera by Moment. I'll share these in my Instagram story so you guys can see this. It says I need to update my app. But what is really cool about this one is, I don't know if you can see this circle here. There's another circle on here. If you take 2 fingers and tap, you can separate your focus from your exposure. So say you want to focus on something that's closer to the camera, but you want to expose for your highlights, like in the background of the frame, you can adjust those. The VSCO app also, the camera on the VSCO app, you can do the same thing by separating those. If you just tap with 2 fingers, it'll separate them, which is really cool. And then, yeah, let me see what manual is so I can show you what this one looks like too. Manual camera. Uh-oh, this one might be gone. I'll look and I'll put it up if I find manual, or they changed what their little symbol looks like. But those are 2 really great options as well. So again, if you guys have any questions, just shoot me a DM or an email or whatever, and I'm here to help. So, all right. Thanks for tuning in today, ladies. We'll see you around. Bye.
Bye.